Dragger, an original novel by Robert Napier, narration and images powered by AI. Chapter 9, Moon and Heart. Losano hopped onto the dock. A stiff breeze made for choppy water, rocking her rowboat and smothering her face in her own wild white blonde hair. Her first mate, Kochaba, sat heavy in the back between the oars. He handed her up 2 large satchels. Lo, being roughly half his size, slouched under the weight, but bore it. "We're not getting paid enough," smirked Kochaba, a middle-aged Grokan and pirate. "This will be the last time." Lo winked at him. He shook his big, scruffy head at her. She wasn't very tall, but looked lanky in her form-fitting knee-length coat and brown leather jackboots. Her cutlass was short too, but when she casually rested her hand across the hilt, it looked deadly enough. She went halfway up the dock before looking back at her first mate. "Wait for me. There's someone I want to talk to." Kochaba sniffed the wind like a hound. "Phew, hurry back." The Gnarlstead docks were tucked away in one of the countless little coves along the Hurin River. The dense copses of cane, bushy reeds, and expansive willow trees that lined the bank combined with the perpetual fog to make a perfect camouflage. This was especially true considering the docks themselves were more molded than made from those same materials. Not that anyone in their right mind would go looking for Gnarlstead, but without being shown the way, they were more likely to end up as crocodile shit than to find the War Ghoul's grotto. Rillers were riverine raiders that moved freely up and down the Junlin on their longboats. Essentially, pirates. They had been annoying travelers in small villages since time immemorial. They struck without warning on either side of the Hurin or Arvendur and then disappeared into the Vinian Sea. It was believed they came from across the sea, from the fabled land of Ra-Bakan, but that was speculation, and there was no reason to think they came from anywhere other than the poor and disenfranchised of the valley. Their numbers were unknown, and there were countless clans and factions constantly battling over territory. They were known to have lairs and hideouts among the local towns, and after a raid, they simply blended into the background. They lived, worked, and married among the townsfolk and free peoples, coming together and dispersing as needs dictated. They weren't interested in killing for political reasons or in occupying the land. They believed in redistributing goods and gold among ordinary people, and for that reason, they were a dangerous nuisance to some and plucky heroes to others. Sometimes they worked within families. Other times, they hired themselves out to whoever had a ship. If Rillers believed in a higher power, it was survival, plain and simple. They did what they felt was necessary to feed themselves and their kin. The lands below Daloran were rich and fertile, while the swamps aggressively resisted cultivation. The Twin Rivers gave the Rillers all the opportunity they needed to redress the imbalance. As a proud river pirate, Losano had a healthy appreciation for secret lairs and hidden fortresses, but the Gnarlstead Gorsty was the worst place she had ever seen or smelled. Climbing the steep embankment almost on all fours through the ferns, the first thing she saw was the gore pen. The gores had gotten big, very big. The pen was the nearest thing to the river, and a steady flood of gore filth poured down the bank. This potent fertilizer only reinforced the curtain of plant life that shrouded Gnarlstead from prying eyes. The sound of flies filled the air until it was almost inaudible, but they were mercifully uninterested in anything but the giant pigs. The fence, doubly reinforced and braced, was almost as high as Lo's head. The massive shoulders of the beasts were visible, quivering in the sunlight. Frankly, the whole thing gave Lo the creeps. Wiping her gloves on the broad leaves of the fronds, she called out impatiently, "Hey, Dee." It was a wonder anyone could hear anything over the endless grunts and squeals of the beasts. "I know you're in there." Lo started to step up on the lowest rung of the fence when one of the gores caught wind of her and shoved its tusk. the size of her cutlass, through the gap. "Fuck me!" shrieked Lo, and jumped back with shock and disgust. "Damn it, Dee, I know you can hear me. Come here a bit." When Lo stood back from the fence, she could see the shape of a young woman rise above the gore bags. Like a puppy, she bounded to Lo's call, and Lo felt the same sentimental attachment to the girl as one to a stray dog that doesn't know you well enough to fear you, and you don't have the heart to chase off. Just as Lo had hopped onto the dock, Dex leapt onto the back of an enormous gore. She and the gores had grown since last season. The smallish girl was probably 15 or so, but no one was keeping track. She looked more feral than any of the pirates Lo knew. Her hair was cropped close on one side of her head, but long and curly on the rest, like a black cataract across her face. She skipped over the gores' backs, like crossing a stream, and if Lo didn't know any better, she'd swear the animals were helping her. Dex nimbly landed on the edge of the fence, balanced on it like an acrobat, showing off for her best friend, Lo. "That's pretty neat, Dee. Come down." Dex landed in the mud. Lo half expected an excited hug from the filthy waif, but was half relieved that Dex probably didn't know what a hug was. Lo reached into her satchel and came up with 2 bottles of hackberry juice. "Have a drink with me?" offered Lo. Dex reached eagerly for the bottle, but recoiled with mistrust. "It's all right," said Lo. "Made it myself, and if you don't like the taste, it also kills lice." Dex slowly took the beverage, but held it at arm's length. "Father says we have to fight for everything. I don't want to fight you." Lo laughed. "Sen Kahijo, what have they been teaching you here?" "I don't understand," said Dex, her reddened cheeks vanishing into her hair. "Well, Daddy isn't wrong, I suppose, but I already fought harder than I should have for these, so the cosmos are square." Dex still didn't understand, but she was thirsty, and Lo had always been not like everyone else. Dex and Lo made their way toward the manor house, casually sipping on the hackberry juice. Dex didn't really know what sort of business Lo Sano had with Aunt Ruby, and she knew better than to ask. She could tell, though, that they didn't get along. "Ruby won't be happy to see you." "Why is that?" asked Lo, unsurprised, but edgy. "She says you killed Rux. She says he tried to hide on your ship during the last carving night, and you chopped him up and threw him in the river." Lo laughed. "Why would I chop up Ruxy? You know I always liked him." "I don't know. People kill each other all the time, don't they?" "No, they don't," huffed Lo. "I don't anyway. I'm just a courier, that's all." She tapped the satchel slung over her shoulder. Dex was greatly relieved by this news and started in on a story about gores. Lo wasn't really listening. Frankly, she just enjoyed the attention and esteem the girl gave her and didn't invest too much in conversation. Some people think they're predators, but the truth is way more interesting. Gores aren't just pigs. They combine the nimbleness of goats with the strength of an ox and bite harder than a fenwolf. They don't have to eat other animals on account that they can eat anything else they want. You know, I can't even eat bacon anymore. Just can't. Vago says. Lo stopped the girl there. "You ought to take it easy, Dex. You may be the only sensible person on this side of Slow Smile, but those animals are dangerous. If you stay here, one day whammo slammo, you're going to be a grease spot in the gore sty. This is my home. I know it smells bad, and it's muddy all the time, and there are flies everywhere, and sometimes they bite and all. But there are also carrot flowers, little gardens, and ducklings, and Father takes care of us when no one else would. You didn't always feel that way. Rux told me you wanted to leave more than anyone." Dex shuffled and swatted a bogfly. "No, I just like hearing about Deloran and the big ships you talk about. That's all. Just talk." Lo could see she had hurt the girl's pride, and there was something sweet in her shyness. It filled Lo with terror to think what Ruby would do when she realized Dex had become a young woman. Only malnutrition and pig shit had protected her so far. "I've missed you, kid." "Well, things haven't been the same since Rux went missing. It's been so quiet. I guess sometimes I can't hardly stand it. Maybe Rux escaped. Have you thought of that? Maybe he took a big ship to Deloran, and he's long gone living the good life. Dex tried to smile. It was a nice pretend. She shook her head. I know the difference between life and fairy tales. I know you're just trying to make me feel better about Rux being gone, but there's no escape from Gnarlstead. If you take the road, you'll meet Father out there, or the war ghouls marching up and down. If you leave the road, the bogs will swallow you alive. Lo looked around, then leaned close to Dex. I didn't come just to see your Aunt Ruby. I shouldn't tell you this, but I don't want you to, I don't know, feel abandoned or anything. Dex stared at her, with the bottle between her lips, mystified. And if I don't come back, I want you to know why. Dex's eyes widened. What are you talking about? I made some friends, she whispered. We're going into business with the Josen. Dex was stunned. Join the enemy? Are you serious? Quiet down, will you? You got a mouth bigger than a gore's wallow. I'm sorry. I'm quiet. Lo shook her head nervously. My friend has a friend in Gurukal who might help us. You're crazy. You shouldn't talk like that. Rux used to talk like that, and now he's what? Missing. Dex, I'm not going to wait for the Crush to draft me and my ship into service. The war is spreading, and I want to be on the right side. I want to be on my side. Dex kicked a rock, and I'm stuck here. I thought you were going with your father after moon season. You'll get your chance to get out of this rot pit. Not likely. Father thinks I'm worthless, and there has been a lot of unrest among the Riverine raiders since Father left. They even raided Sunkenstead. Lo took this opportunity, not to mention she was one of those pirates. Come on, your aunt could hold off a whole raiding party of Rillers with her gore whip. I know, but she hasn't got enough piggers if she's going to make the place pay off. I couldn't leave her now. I feel for you, Deedles, but you're going to have to learn that what seems to be true, right, and important sometimes isn't. The world isn't what you've been taught. Nothing happens here. This is just how life is, that's all. Well, it's not all life is. Things can always change. Dex rubbed her nose. Are you going to be around a while? Lo nodded towards the moorgate. Looks like you've got company coming. I'm leaving very soon. Then, I guess I won't see you. Maybe someday. Hey, I'll keep a lookout for you. Sure. The pair was met by one of Dragger's war ghouls, swaggering out from the main house. Lo was unsure whether this was a man or a woman. So heavily, they were overlaid in iron and leather and bone. Not one to be easily unsettled. Lo handed off the satchel to the creature with a breezy indifference. She wondered if she used to know this one. It was too small to be Crux. Maybe Lurk or Slake. About 2 years ago, Slake had found Coral and Kasaban rutting without him and brought both their heads to Dragger. Dex eyed the war ghoul sideways, visibly stiffening and hiding the bottle Lo had given her behind her back. Well, she said, with all the indifference she could copy. Take care, Captain Sano. So long, Dee. Lo reluctantly turned on her heels and headed for the dock. The afternoon sun cast long shadows at the edge of the swamp that surrounded Gnarlstead. A caravan of travelers emerged from those shadows, moving funereally across the windy moor towards the compound. Dex instantly recognized them as Sawjaws in their scale armor and alligator skins. Though no one had told her outright, she guessed they were called Sawjaws because of the strings of sharp teeth they wrapped around the shumag, concealing their faces. In the outline of her memory, Dex couldn't quite articulate that they reminded her of the rickety scarecrows that warded the fields of her lost village. The so-called Sawjaws were traveling bands of Shojin swamp people, rumored to live in vast numbers in the shadowy glades of willow trees. They sometimes traded with Aunt Ruby, mostly roots, and game for pork. Sawjaws were scavengers, slavers, and raiders. They were not particularly dangerous to anyone here, not while war ghouls were around, but not particularly liked either. They were just another danger of the open moors. They rarely attacked without provocation, but were not too proud to rob anyone they could ambush. That being the case, they often brought with them various goods and trinkets to sell. They traveled in a large, wagon-like vehicle. It was domed and camouflaged with earthen debris to make it appear like a small hill or burial mound that moved through the terrain. The wheels were covered by cloth sown with moss and grass to make it silent over stone. The saw jaws rushed like rats around the creeping wagon. The vehicle was pulled by tall, thin runkas with their heads carried very low. Runkas are a leggy type of horse with stripes of brown, black, and white on their extremities, a spike of coarse hair along the neck, 3 sharp toes on each foot, and a long, wispy tail. Their muzzles are longer than typical horses, but with stronger jaws, and their orange eyes flicker with intelligence. They are built to survive in a terrain that combines mushy ground with jagged rocks and fierce predators throughout. Since the Sawjaws weren't concerned with the hierarchy of Gnarlstead, Dex took the opportunity to play taskmaster and oversaw the caravan's arrival at the Moorgate. The dozen or so travelers showed her some deference as she stood nearby, pigstick in hand. One of them noticed her patrolling atop the flagstone wall. He bowed majestically to her, and she laughed. "Greetings from Swamp," he said in a strange accent, muffled by the scarf over his face. "Have we permissions to present wares?" Dex laughed again, because no one ever asked her for permission before. "Oh yes," she said excitedly. But then, remembering that she was always supposed to be serious, she pretended to be the great Captain Sano. She held out her pig stick like a cutlass and commanded, "But be quick." That was the only command she could come up with. The man bowed again, even deeper than before. Of course," he said. Dex stood arms akimbo, chin up, and lips pursed like Aunt Ruby. "And don't make a mess. And don't argue, and no gore play, or there'll be storms, mind you. Storms up and down, I tell you. And don't do any nonsense either." "Oh no nonsenses, of course," said the Sawjaw. Dex laughed and hopped down. "I'm not really in charge," she said. "I'm just Dex. An honor to meet you, just Dex. You're funny. So are you." Dex didn't know how to feel about that, but Father always says war ghouls are serious. So she toughened up like Captain Sano and said, "No, I'm not. I'm very serious." But the Sawjaw laughed again, and that made her mad, so she readied herself for a fight. The Sawjaw raised his arms in supplication. "Apologies, sincere. Am new here. Name is Vegas." While many Sawjaws had a faint orange tint in their eyes, his were brighter than any she had seen. She was overcome with curiosity and couldn't help but ask, "Can I see your face?" The man drew back. "Why do you ask?" "I don't know. How can we meet if I can't see your face?" The Sawjaw didn't laugh, but was amused all the same. "Point fair. Only, what?" "Only, do not wish to scare." "I'm not scared of anything," said Dex, but somehow her throat squeezed up on her at all the wrong syllables. "Very well." The Sawjaw bowed while pulling back his headscarf. He was a beautiful young man. His skin was the color of warm sand, and his hair was the purest black. Dex had never seen a handsome man before, not like that. She stared unabashedly at him. The Sawjaw waited politely before finally saying, "Now are acquainted." "You're not ugly," said Dex at last. "Thank you, I think." "Why would that?" "I mean your face. Scare me." "You see here?" said Vegas, and he pointed to his cheek. There was a dark spot of discolored flesh. "What's that?" "That is mark of my people. Shojinso is sign of greatly significance. Am destined for priesthood and greatness. Over time, dark will cover face entire." "What do you mean?" Vegas reached into his cloak and pulled out a small purse. From inside, he produced a clump of dried leaves and fibers. "Ixwa, you call murkroot, sacrament ours. Most potent grows darken, God's hollow. We chew for powers." "Powers? Like what?" "Here," he handed her a pinch. "Rub between fingers." Dex did so cautiously. A few moments later, she felt a strange sensation in her hand, and then she exclaimed, "I can taste it. I don't know what it's like. Is freedom. Show Jinso like moon and heart. Ixwakiri venom divine. Vegas took what he had given her and stashed it in his cloak. The others had begun to take interest in this interaction. He laughed nervously as he pulled up his scarf. Must go, he said with a final bow. Dex wondered at this sudden departure, but before he had gone, she ran after him. Wait, I want to show you something. The Sawjaw turned back patiently. Dex tilted her neck and pushed aside her dense, wavy hair to expose 2 prominent parallel scars along the side of her head. Look, she said, I have markings too. Indeed you do. Perhaps. Also greatness destined. Dex squinted at him. That's a weird thing to say. Farewell, Just Dex, said Vegas as he vanished among the others. The Sawjaws muttered gibberish as they busily arranged their merchandise from their enormous wagon made of turtle shells and gar bones. Dex was astonished how peculiar Vegas was, and at the same time, it was impossible to tell him apart. Not one to linger. Dex wanted to see all the odd baubles on display. She was not at all interested in the row of battered slaves they paraded in front of the bulky swamp wagon. The Sawjaws scurried around, fussing over their wares, straightening them up, or brushing the dried mud off their clothes and faces. It wasn't long before they were noticed from the main house. Out came Ruby Lone. Her reddish eyes were sunken in a makeup-caked face. Ruby beckoned Dex to her side, and she came without hesitation, though Dex, slender and slouching, was by now bored with the business. She dutifully shadowed the mistress as she carefully inspected each slave. One of the Sawjaws walked ahead of Ruby, spouting an animated sales pitch in a growling sort of language, unintelligible to Dex. A voice called out from one of the doorways across the courtyard. Dex jogged over to see Vago standing smugly against the doorframe. Over the years, Vago had grown quite tall, but thin and angular. His bones seemed too long for his body, yet there was a thread of power in his expanding frame. Tell Ruby, we need a strong farmhand this time. She knows what she's doing, protested Dex, mostly because she couldn't stand Vago's know-it-all attitude. She returned to her mistress as she looked over the laborers for sale with the Sawjaw slaver. Now, she was examining a grim-looking and run-down middle-aged man. With the same acumen, she judged a whelp for culling. She pinched and prodded the slave. I don't need a skinny old schoolteacher, she grumbled. But before she could move on, the man quickly spoke. Madam, not in an environment such as this, but there's not much to choose from since the plague. Ruby took a quick step back from the slaves and turned on the head Sawjaw. Hey, what are you trying to pull? You know who I am? How dare you bring 6 slaves into my home? The hunched-over Sawjaw grumbled and made several apologies. The thin man tapped Dex on the shoulder. Excuse me, miss, but that woman is a surgeon. He pointed at a slave hardly visible at the end of the line. She was about Dex's height with matted dreadlocks, looking very out of place. She looked to Dex like someone who got in the wrong line by mistake and hadn't realized it yet. She's a healer, a real deal, said the teacher. Best to keep quiet, whispered Dex out of frank concern. Just hope Ruby doesn't buy you and move on out of this place. Doesn't seem so bad, said the thin man, slapping his own face where a bogfly had bit him. I won't spend another moment in that god-forsaken wagon, and if I'm going to stay here, I want a good healer nearby. There was something so earnest in his face that Dex acted without thinking. Aunt Ruby, what about that funny one? Ruby rubbed her temples and noticed the thin man standing out of line, tired of being surrounded by hot gores, slimy Sawjaws, plagued slaves, and Dex too. She growled at him. What I really need is a slave that understands hard work, bad food, and total obedience. He sprung to attention. Madam, I'm quite fond of hard work. And as for food, I hardly care for it myself. Only sometimes I have to fill the old rumble bag with a few crusts and rinds. As for obedience, well, can you shovel pig shit? Of course I can, madam. As you wisely deduced, I was a school teacher for 20 years. All right, shut up, snapped Ruby as she turned to the Sawjaw merchant. I'll have this one. Dex, take these two over to the gore sty, and don't be late for feeding. But I'm supposed to start sword train. Ruby turned a severe eye on her little ward. It's a waste of time for you to learn anything about warfighting. You're a sassy runt, and nothing but a burden on your father and me. Now, do as I say. Yes, Auntie, she answered crisply. She turned to the newly purchased slaves. Let's go. Ruby paid the fawning Sawjaw as Dex and the slaves trudge off toward the gore sty. The two slaves walked behind Dex, and she heard one to the other say rather loudly, I don't care what these people do to us. At least we'll finally be rid of those disgusting swampers. It was nearly midday as the entire town gathered on the sacred hillside of Figadern. There hadn't been a wedding like this for more than 50 years. Atticus Rafferty, the son of the village alderman, was finally set to marry. It all happened rather suddenly, but hadn't surprised anyone. The bride was a beautiful maiden from one of the small neighboring villages. It was pure happenstance, the way they told it, that the young woman had become lost in the market, only to find her way by mistake into the middle of the groom's hunting party. They were returning from a rather disappointing hunt and were in poor spirits, but found an avenue for their heroism by escorting the maid back to the town square. And of course, an immediate bond formed there, and a courtship began. Such is the way with young people, so impetuous, and yes, stubborn as well. But then again, the man's marriage was long overdue. The alderman had been looking for some time to secure his bloodline. There had been plenty of propositions, but the young man insisted on marrying for love. And, as is so often the case, true love eludes us for so long, only to appear under our very noses. Anyone could look at the couple and see there was something special blossoming there. It was no surprise at all when the wedding was announced. And despite the haste, the accommodations were spectacular. No expense had been spared. Never mind that those expenses came directly from the local taxes. Today, it seemed a wondrous act of generosity. As excited as the town was to see their first son happily married, they were perhaps more excited to get past the ceremony and begin the feast. Ah, but they were lovely, standing atop the sacred hillside of Figadern as a gentle breeze moved the trees like a murmuring choir. Atticus was handsome in the traditional garb, pale yellows and soft blues. And the bride, the bride was a vision of fresh beauty. Her hair was long and auburn, and her skin was fair as cream. But she was no porcelain doll, mind you. She had been seen on several occasions spitting, and even cussed when she burned her finger on a pie dish. But a delightful, smiling young lady, if a little rough around the edges. There had been some controversy when it was discovered she had no family to invite to the wedding, most uncustomary for a Figadern wedding. But in this day and age, it was not unheard of for entire villages to disappear in the middle of the night. The alderman himself insisted on performing the ceremony. He could barely stand the idea of someone upstaging him, even if it was his own son. He seemed so proud today that he was likely to burst. It was truly heartwarming how he admired the maid. It was rumored he considered marrying her himself, except for being already married, of course. Just as he was saying the final words, so that the townsfolk could finally enjoy all those pies, a horrific scream pierced the afternoon air. The usher crashed into the pie table, tossing crust and custard into the sky, only to come raining down again. The audience gasped. A dark mass hovered over the usher. It was a black rider on a black horse. The sheer size of the intruder allowed disbelief to linger over the crowd. The rider approached, and slowly it became clear, however unbelievable, that the North Raider had come to Figadern. For years, the warlord known as Draggr had raided up and down the Don Valley. No longer opposed by the Vinian Knights or the Deltaic Legion, Draggr terrorized the entire region. His name was a byword for demonic power. An entire generation of Dons had grown up with the belief that the North Raider was lurking in the twilight to drag away the naughty and the lost. They would become his soulless ghouls. One of the groomsmen rushed down the hill to confront the interloper. Dragger's mount turned to face him. The groomsman barked an order. "Leave at once." There came no reply from the bony mask. A fierce hammer appeared slowly from the dark robes. The head was twice the size of a fist, with a long curved spike on the back end, and all over sticky with blood and hair. Dragger precisely placed the top of the weapon against the groomsman's chest. The groomsman lost all will to fight and stood paralyzed before the gore slayer. With just a nudge, Dragger pushed away the groomsman, who, despite being humiliated as a coward, was certain he had made the right choice. Dragger rode his horse irreverently to the top of the sacred hillside of Figadern, riding between the rows of benches. The audience was deathly silent, some failing even to breathe as he passed. To his credit, Atticus stepped between his fiancée and the North Raider. The alderman in turn stepped behind the maid. "You're not invited. Please leave," said the groom, not defiant, but optimistic. Dragger laid his hammer across his lap and seemed to honestly consider leaving, though it was impossible to know behind the mask. "On the contrary," said the maid, "I believe you insisted he come." Atticus turned. "What do you mean? You invited him. He's my father, silly." There was a stunned silence, then a simultaneous gasp. "Come, Gretch," said the man behind the mask. "I have need of you." "Yes, father," said the maid with a quick bow. Dragger lowered the warhammer to boost her onto the horse. "No," lurched the groom. "You won't take her." "It's all right, Addie," said Gretch, putting her hand on his shoulder. "I know it's hard, but think of it this way. I was going to murder and rob you tonight. So really, this is a good thing. Thank you for being so sweet. Goodbye." She sprung up onto the horse behind Dragger. The steed reared up and wheeled around. Dragger spurred the animal, and they raced down the sacred hillside of Figadern. "Why'd you do that, father?" "I was almost done. The barons have called for a council." "Finally? I know what that means."
Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe.